Well, joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have Press TV's very own Amina Taylor. Joining us from London also, we have journalist, author, and activist Fra Hughes, who's with us from Belfast. Let's start off with Amina in London. Amina, why are prices rising so quickly?
Well, it's just more bad news, isn't it, Badia? Because as well as every link on the supply chain becoming more expensive, I think it's past the place now where we can just simply say this is about the situation in Ukraine. We know that there have been other factors that have been pressing on this for a while as well. Britain is one of the countries, one of the most developed Western countries with the highest inflation rates. So I think the Brexit argument still has to be made about some uncertainties in the market there. Obviously, the Ukraine situation has not helped. It also has not been helped by what some might argue is an inept mismanagement on the part of the British government here, from wasting billions on wasted PPP contracts to just a lack of putting forward credible alternatives for building the economy, and not simply sitting back and saying, well, we've had COVID, we've had the situation in Ukraine, and now we're just going to let the markets try and right themselves. That argument clearly has failed. If someone like myself, who's seen a squeeze in very real terms on just how far your buck can stretch, for those who are already in that bottom third of Britain's economic group, who already spend a larger proportion of their salaries on food and energy and so on, this is going to be stiflingly horrible news, Badia. I mean, where does the money come from? Where does the help come from? Richie Sunak there mentioned he's using all the toolkits in the government's armory here to try and make something happen. Well, Mr. Sunak, when will that happen? When will that bear fruits? When will more people continue to be at food banks and to be seriously considering whether or not they can choose whether they're going to eat or whether they're going to put money towards other things? It's a ludicrous situation for Britain right now, Badia. Absolutely ludicrous and highly concerned.
Fra Hughes, give us your assessment of the situation and whether you believe that this cost of living crisis is in for the long haul.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say I agree with everything that Amina has just said. When you look at the economic forecast going forward, they are talking about 11% inflation. They're talking about wages in real terms going down by 2%. The GDP growth of the UK, which is in and around 4%, next year is predicted to shrink to 0.6. So the economy is going to shrink. Inflation is going to continue. Wages will continue to stagnate. So the lower third of the people who are already financially struggling will be possibly pushed into poverty. So when countries like China have taken 40 million people out of poverty, Britain, the United Kingdom, which currently has the second largest GDP growth in the G7, next year is predicted to have the least economic growth. So one country can take people out of poverty, and yet the UK, which is one of the leading G7 economies, will push people into poverty. And they're saying that maybe £1,500 will have to be found by those families to cover the extra costs of fuel and food and the energy prices. And then there are already families that are skipping at least one meal per day in order to try and make sure there's enough food for the entire family. And parents, single parents in some cases, are skipping meals in order to allow their children to eat. And as
Well, stay with us as we're going to take a look at some online reactions to this news. The first reaction comes from John Stepek. UK producer price inflation still brutal. factory gate prices up 15.7% year over year in May. That's the highest since the late 70s. Input prices up 22.1%. That's the highest on record. Since at least 1985. Victoria Sillerid writes, in reality, government says that putting our wages up will increase inflation and keep it higher for longer. But at the same time, they're increasing all prices for everything. Can they actually explain how are people supposed to even survive by getting £9.50? And Simon TM 1310 writes, after the first lockdown, when restrictions were lifted, the price of shipping containers shot through the roof from, in some cases, hundreds to tens of thousands of pounds. This is why global inflation is where it is. What is government going to do about it? Nothing. Let's go back to our guests now. Amina, let's pick up on that last reaction there. What is government going to do about it? What can the British government do about it at this point in time?
Well, there are already some coolers that are being introduced into the economy, but that's really being led by the Bank of England here. That's popped interest rates up from 1% to 1.25% in the belief that by dousing and dampening the rate at which we can borrow and spend money, that might cool the engine a little bit. But I think some of this is also about confidence in the leadership. Gordon Brown, the former leader of the Labour Party and very short-lived British Prime Minister, talked about a failure of leadership here, that there were so many issues that were clouding the priority tray for especially this government, that it made it very difficult, very hard for commentators like myself to see where the solutions would come from. And let's be clear on something here, Badia. This cost of living crisis is not just being felt by the most vulnerable, but when you look at people who are supposed to be our lawmakers, the ones who are trying to, they say, get us out of this, do you know that last year, MPs claimed $3 million in rent expenses? Now, if you and I were in a position to do that, could you blame us for trying? But these guys are on there's no urgency here to fix the problem, because in a lot of these cases, they're okay. So why are you worried about a family of four who can't really feed themselves as well as they could the same time last year, or who are worried about their job prospects? Because what this does, Badia, it's not just about what happens now and how I'm able to cobble together a meal now. What happens in 6 months? What happens in a year? Can I make plans? Can my children have treats? Can I even get myself a haircut? These are all things that feed into a sense that there's just a kind of hopelessness about life at the moment. There is no upside, there's no good news at the moment, and that's not a fun place to be. It really is not. And Richie Sunak seems to be devoid of ideas right now.
Frau Hughes, I'd like to get your thoughts on the issue as well of trying to fix the problem. The Bank of England is predicting that the inflation rate would exceed 11% in October, but it says there's nothing it can do about it. Amina also touched upon the sense of hopelessness that Britons are feeling right now. Unpack that for us, please.
We're going to have a winter of discontent. I think that the railway workers' strike has shown that there is a huge potential for a backlash against the government and its failed policies. I believe that the economists are forecasting that inflation won't return to 2% until the end of 2024. So we're talking about 2.5 years before we are back in the position where we were in February or March this year. I think the people who are going to suffer, they are really at the whim of the free market. I don't think the Conservatives or any government has real influence outside raising interest rates to try and defer what is basically profiteering. I heard someone say that the price of oil is nowhere near as high as it's been previously, and yet we are paying such a huge premium at both the fuel depots and through the energy companies. So this is speculation and profiteering, and the government is doing nothing about it. So the vulnerable will continue to pay for the excesses of the profits made by those connected with government and with big business.
All right, thanks a lot, journalist, author, and activist Fra Hughes, joining us from Belfast, and a special thanks to our very own Amina Taylor, speaking to us from the British capital, London. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.